Tolson walks in, gets it cut. Tolson shoots, score!
Off the faceoff, Bears with numbers down low, right side, they score! A rocket from Connor McMichael.
Perfetti with Cease, no crossover. Perfetti snaps a shot, scores! What a shot! Cole Perfetti! He snaps it up over the glove of Anderson, picks his corner.
Hello guys, welcome back. My name is Nathan, and today we are going to go through every single NHL team's number one prospect and rank them from worst to best. Now, how today's video is going to work is that I've already gone through every single NHL team, pretty much going through their number one consensus prospect, and then ranking them from 32 down to number one worst to best, and today is the day we finally reveal those rankings. So when it comes to the worst and best number one NHL prospects, where do I see your favorite team's number one prospect going in the rankings, and who do I see as the best prospects right now in the NHL? Watch till the end for the entire rankings and every single pick, and hit that subscribe button if you are new. 60% of the people watching are not subscribed. If you like hockey, if you like prospects, this channel is the place to be. And as you go through this video and watch till the end, you'll find that there's a big divide in terms of the teams that have a great number one prospect and the teams that have a not so great number one prospect. And we're going to start out with a great example in this video. In the rankings, coming in at number 32, the worst number one prospect in the entire National Hockey League. It's no surprise this team has the worst number one prospect. They've won back-to-back Stanley Cups. They have a pretty decent excuse. We're going to go on to number 32 and go on to the Tampa Bay Lightning's number one prospect in Cal Foote. Now, Cal Foote to me is a perfectly solid prospect, nothing too wrong about him. Even though he likely won't fill out that top 20 potential he had as a top 20 pick, this is still a guy that has good skating, good overall awareness, will be a solid player for the Bolts. Played 35 games last year, was perfectly okay, got replaced by David Savard, and will likely have a decent role next year for Tampa. But in terms of number one prospects in the league, he's definitely, in my opinion, the worst, and probably has one of the least potentials of any of these guys. Now we're going to move on to number 31, though, and go on to one of the worst number one prospects in the league. Another team that's been contending for quite a while, and though some people might say Zach Bolduc is their number one prospect, I still think consensus-wise, coming into 31, I think the St. Louis Blues' number one consensus prospect is Scott Perunovich. Now, I don't have anything against this guy. I still think he has potential, but he had a season-ending injury last year, and we still don't really know his status as of right now, and it doesn't seem like with St. Louis defense, he's going to have much of a spot, and he's coming out of college. He's pretty high up there in age. I think Perunovich still has potential, but as a number one guy, definitely lesser so compared to some of the higher up teams in the league. But now we can move on to number 30 and go on to another contending team here. Coming at number 30 from the Pittsburgh Penguins and their number one prospect, I have Samu Poulin. Now, I like Samu Poulin quite a bit. I am in the first round back in 2019, and I still think there's quite a bit of potential there in terms of skill and in terms of skating, but he still has a lot of development to go, and for a team like Pittsburgh, it's easily their best prospect right now, but still in the end, compared to some of the other prospects you'll see later on, there's a lot more potential out there, and just simply put, a lot better prospects at the number one spot. But next up, we're going to move on to the number 29 spot, one of the worst number one prospects in the NHL, but still a guy I think has a lot of potential. We're going to go to a team that's a playoff contender, has traded a lot of picks, has had a lot of prospects graduate, but in my opinion, the clear number one prospect they have left for the New York Islanders, I have their number one prospect in Aatu Räty. Now, Aatu Räty, getting him in the 50s is just an absolute steal in my opinion. After he was drafted, you could start to see that confidence coming back to him, which I think is hugely key for his development. He's a guy, though, that is flatlined offensively, but still has great defensive IQ and potential there. I think if he maxes out as a middle six center, you're laughing, and I think for the Islanders, it could be a huge steal there, too, in the 50s of this past draft. Now, we're going to move on to the next pick, though, and move on to number 28, and next up, I'm going to go with Matthew Coronato of the Calgary Flames. Now, I think Matthew Coronato was a solid pick where the Flames got him. I don't really have too many complaints there. Just in terms of some of the other prospects you'll see on this list, I think there's more potential and more talent out there. When it comes to Coronato, though, he's a great offensive, no BS player that on the power play, in terms of passing, in terms of playmaking, has great abilities. I think he will be a good NHL player someday. It's just about that pure talent and potential that I think there's some other prospects that I'd rather rather prefer. Now we're going to go on to the next pick, though, and go on to number 27. And I'm now going to go with the number 1 prospect from the Vancouver Canucks and move on to Vasily Podkolzin. Now, once again, just like some other prospects, nothing against Podkolzin. I think he'll be a solid middle six, physical, size player that brings some grit to the Vancouver Canucks. But in the end, again, compared to other prospects, compared to other players in terms of potential, I'm a guy that loves potential and prospects. Vasily Podkolzin has some of that. I think he could maybe be a second-line player, but that's where he maxes out. And compared to some of the other number 1 prospects, it's a little bit lesser so compared to what other teams are bringing up. And a great example of what other teams are bringing in terms of potential prospects, we're now going to go on to number 26, move on to the Chicago Blackhawks' number 1 prospect, and move on to their first rounder of 2019 in German left winger, Lukas Reichel. Now, to me, Lukas Reichel, in terms of pure potential, is just radiating with it. He's a guy that I've liked for a long time in terms of an offensive first, great skater, great passer, great fundamental offensive player, and although he could definitely stand to build that frame out and be a little bit more consistent defensively, this is a guy that in terms of potential, if Chicago can use him right, could become a second liner, I think, at the NHL level. Now we're going to move on to the next pick here, though, and go on to the defenseman of the year in the NCAA this past season. Had a fantastic season, and I see that transitioning onto the NHL. This is especially where we get into the great prospects territory. We're now going to move on to number 25 and move on to the Philadelphia Flyers' number 1 prospect in Cam York. Now, I have no problems with Cam York, and even though some people might have him a little bit higher, I still think he's going to be a great prospect, likely a top 4 guy that, again, specializes in offense, isn't the worst defensively, and can hold his own, which for Philadelphia, especially that defense, is badly needed. Now we're going to move on to another defensive prospect, though, at number 24, and another number 1 prospect in the NHL. I'm now going to move on to my favorite team's number 1 prospect, coming from the Dallas Stars. Their number 1 is Thomas Harley. Now, especially with Jason Robertson and Jake Onger graduating, Harley, I think, is the best one left, though you have Maverick Bourque and other guys as well on top of that. But I think when it comes to Harley, he brings a lot of solid fundamental qualities that will make him, I think, a top 4 defenseman in the future. Great skating, one of the best skaters in the entire prospect world right now. He's a guy that in terms of passing, though, has great IQ, great awareness, great consistency, and defensively has gone better at the pro game. I think he'll transition quite well and could be in the NHL as a full-time guy this next season. But next up, coming at number 23, the 23rd number 1 prospect in the NHL, we're going to move on to a guy that I was pretty high on in the 2019 draft and has continued to fulfill that promise. We're going to move on to the Toronto Maple Leafs number 1 prospect and move on to Nick Robertson. I still like Nick Robertson quite a bit, even though he dealt with some injury issues and some inconsistency issues in the AHL this past year. He was solid considering the circumstances, and in terms of a goal scorer, offensive player, I still love what Nick Robertson can bring. He'll likely be with the Leafs this next year and could have a pretty high role, and I think the potential, the sky's really the limit when it comes to his goal scoring potential. Now we're going to move on to number 22, though, and move on to a player that I was kind of interested in with the 2021 draft, where he would end up. He ended up going to the Arizona Coyotes, and I think it could be a pretty solid spot for him. We're going to move on to the next pick and go on to Dylan Guenther. The Arizona Coyotes' number 1 prospect, honestly, is pretty solid. I like Guenther quite a bit in terms of IQ, in terms of offensive play. There is still quite a bit of skating issues that I think could be rounded out. Some of the fundamentals, some of the acceleration, I think could be better. But in terms of pure offense, he has a lot to bring. Great shot, great playmaking. I think that could help the Coyotes quite a bit in the future. We're now going to move on to number 21, though, and go on to another prospect that I just have such a great time watching all of the time. We're going to move on to a guy that is a highlight reel every single game from the Columbus Blue Jackets, and their number 1 prospect, I have Kent Johnson. Now, Kent Johnson going 5th overall might have been a little bit high for me, but in terms of pure potential, he could be one of the best prospects in this entire list. A guy that in terms of creativity, in terms of fun, almost has too much on the ice, but I think in terms of offensive potential, there's so much there you could possibly make. I think he, even though his floor is super low, his ceiling is one of the best out of all the prospects I'll talk about today. But next up, we're now going to enter the top 20 number 1 prospects in the NHL, and moving up to a team that might have been like 31 last year. They now move up to number 20 with a great steal in the first round. We're going to move on to the Boston Bruins' number 1 prospect and move on to Swedish winger Fabian Lysell. Now, to me, Fabian Lysell, in terms of pure play on the ice, just has so much to love. He's an energizer. He works hard. He plays the game right. Has great skill, though, on top of it. Solid defensive player, but is great in transition, great speed, great fundamental abilities. I really like Liesel's game quite a bit. I am 6th in my 2021 draft rankings. I think this is a guy that could be a great top 6 winger, and in Boston, I think could work absolutely beautifully. We're now going to move on to number 19, though, and move on to a New York Rangers prospect here. Coming at their number 1 spot, I have Nils Lundkvist. Now, the Rangers would be a lot higher if they still had Alexis Lafreniere or a Capo Caco, obviously, in their prospect pool, but those guys have graduated, and Lundkvist is still a very, very good option. In terms of an offensive D-man, he is brilliant on the power play, great shot, great passing ability. He'll be a great offensive defenseman for the Rangers going into the future, and could be in the NHL as well in 2022. Now we're going to move on to number 18, though, and move on to the New Jersey Devils' number 1 prospect. And I had a hard time deciding whether Luke Hughes or Holtz was their number 1 guy in terms of consensus. I went with Luke Hughes, and I think he ends up at this number 18 spot. Still, perfectly reasonable for the New Jersey Devils, who, just like the Rangers, have had their graduations recently. But with Luke Hughes, I'm 4th in my prospect rankings in 2021. I think this is a guy that could be just absolutely brilliant in terms of offense, in terms of skating, in terms of physical play. There is so much potential, and I think he could be a top pairing D-man if everything works out. But next up, we're going to go to another Metropolitan Division team, and a team that has some great prospects at the high end of things. We're going to move on to number 18, or I guess 17, and move on to the Washington Capitals' number 1 prospect in Connor McMichael. Now, Connor McMichael has just gotten better and better as the years have gone by, and the AHL this year, even though he started a little bit rough, he got better and better and got a lot more comfortable as the season went on. Was great in the World Juniors, but was great in the AHL, and at such a young age, I think potential-wise, there's so much to like. Could be a top 6 winger as well pretty soon, or even maybe even Seider for the Caps in these next couple of seasons. Now we're going to move on to number 16, though, and go on to the Ottawa Senators' number 1 prospect. And again, it's kind of hard to see the consensus here with some of the graduations they have had, but I think the number 1 guy for them easily right now is Jake Sanderson. Now, Jake Sanderson, I've definitely come around to a little bit more compared to my stock on him in the 2019 draft or 2020 draft. I mean, this is a guy that could be a good top 4 defensive, physical defenseman. And hey, for the Senators, that is a perfectly reasonable pick where they got him, even though I would have gone for some other guys at number 5. Still, I think he'll be a super valuable add for the Senators and had a great season as well in the NCAA. Now we're going to go on to number 15, though, inside the top 15 for the number 1 prospects. Next up, another prospect from the 2020 NHL draft, a player that I think is going to be amazing for the Nashville Predators, going on to their number 1 prospect, their future in net, in Yaroslav Askarov. Now, to me, Askarov still has so much potential, and I think people are kind of underrating him. Even though he didn't have the greatest World Juniors, he was sensational in the KHL this past year, and I think he was one of the best goalie prospects Russia has had really in a long, long time, and is one of the best goalie prospects right now in the NHL. He'll be fantastic for the Nashville Predators and will be the future in net for them, alongside UC Saros. Now we're going to go on to number 14, though, and move on to the Vegas Golden Knights' number 1 prospect, and their prospect pool isn't great. It's definitely quarterbacked by this prospect, and who knows, maybe he's involved in a Jack Eichel trade, but for now, for Vegas, their number 1 guy is Peyton Krebs. To me, he was a steal where they got him at 17th overall back in 2019, and that continues to be the case. Even though he has dealt with some injury troubles, he's been elite in the WHL, great in the World Juniors, and I think when it comes to Vegas, he'll be a guy that could be in the NHL as well this next season, and at a pretty high role as well. But now we're going to move on to the 13th spot here, a team with not many high-end prospects, but this player is definitely the exception to that rule. Next up, we're going to move on to number 13, to the Carolina Hurricanes' number 1 prospect, and move on to one of my favorites in Seth Jarvis. Now, I had him 10th overall back in my rankings in 2020. Not many people had him in the top 15 or even top 20, but I had a lot of belief in him, and he even surpassed my expectations when he went to the AHL and just destroyed worlds. This man was on a different level, especially to start out the AHL season. I think that sets a great precedent for his NHL future. This is a guy that I think could be a top 6 power play, just quarterback. Now we're going to move on to number 12, though, and move on to the next pick here. A guy that went, I think, a little bit later than he should have in the first round this past draft. I had him 3rd overall in my rankings, in William Eklund from the San Jose Sharks. Their number 1 guy easily right now. And honestly, William Eklund could be even higher than this, but for me with William Eklund, I think he'll be great in San Jose. And as a 7th overall pick, that's a pick that is an absolute no-brainer in terms of skating, in terms of IQ, in terms of driving play. William Eklund is phenomenal, and I think will be a phenomenal San Jose Shark. Now we're going to move on to number 11, though, and to a player that I have a lot of belief in as well. Going back to the 2020 draft, we're going to move on to the Edmonton Oilers' #1 prospect and move on to Dylan Holloway. Now, to me, Dylan Holloway, even though he's not as good as Cole Caufield, for some people, for me, I don't have him as good as Cole Caufield, but to me, his progression is just as good as you could have possibly hoped. To me, there were some potential issues, and he wasn't really used in the right way with Wisconsin in his draft year. This year, though, he was put in the perfect position alongside Cole Caufield, alongside that team in high opportunities, and he just thrived, to say the least. He was amazing. And even though I don't think he'll be as good as Cole Caufield, this is still a player that'll drive play, create offense in a top 6 role in the NHL, and for where the Oilers got him, that's a fantastic pick. But now we can officially move on to the top 10. And in terms of the teams that are left, we have the Red Wings, we have the Ducks, we have the Panthers, we have the Habs, we have the Kings, we have the Wild, we have the Avs, we got the Sabres, we got the Kraken, I believe. Quite a few teams left and their #1 prospects still on the board. But going on to number 10, the 10th best #1 prospect in the NHL. I'm going to move on to number 10 and go on to the first overall pick in this past draft. From the Buffalo Sabres, I have Owen Power. Now, I have Owen Power, rankings-wise, second in my 2021 rankings, and I still think Owen Power has a lot of potential. I see a lot of the similarities with Tyler Myers, and even though I think he'll be a lot better than that, in Buffalo, it's going to be an interesting development curve. I think for him, though, going back to Michigan is an 100% no-brainer. But now we'll move on to number 9, next up, and I gotta go with my boy, first overall in my 2021 rankings, right above Owen Power. At number 9, I'm going to go with the Seattle Kraken's #1 prospect in Matty Beniers. Matthew Beniers is one of my favorite prospects right now in hockey in terms of overall IQ, in terms of smarts, in terms of consistency, in terms of face-off building, in terms of defense. There is really almost no holes in Matthew Beniers' game, and even though he doesn't project as a great first-line center, this is a guy that will be a top 6 centerman at the NHL level, will lead a team, could be a captain in the future for any NHL team, I think, and I think plays the game the right way. Now we're going to move on to number 8, though, and move on to another great center prospect, this time from the Colorado Avalanche, and this time in the form of Alex Newhook. Now, to me, I think for a lot of people, Alex Newhook and Bowen Byram is pretty much a wash. I would say it's the same way as well for me, though if you went Bowen Byram, he'd probably be around the same spot, maybe a little bit less or so. But to me, Alex Newhook is just so fun to watch, but he also backs that up with hard work. He backs it up with solid physical play, and he's transitioned amazingly onto the pro game. Been solid so far for the Avs, well, both in the playoffs and the regular season. Now we're going to move on to the 7th overall spot here, and another first prospect here that is just amazing. Even though he missed a lot of this past season with COVID complications, I think this is still a player that can max out as a first-line center. We're going to move on to the Minnesota Wild's first-round pick from 2020 and move on to Marco Rossi. Now again, there's not much to talk about with this past year, but it seems like those COVID complications have cleared him, and he will be ready to go for this next season. Could be in the AHL, could be in the NHL perhaps, but definitely for the Minnesota Wild will be a future top 6 centerman and a really good offense, and we'll add that. If they're able to keep Kaprizov, Fiala, and Marco Rossi, that could be one of the best first lines in the next few seasons. But now going inside the top 6, we're now going to move on to the 6th spot and move on to the Winnipeg Jets #1 prospect. And I got to move on to another one of my boys in Cole Perfetti. Now, Cole Perfetti likely will be in the World Juniors, perhaps for Team Canada this next year. Maybe will be in the NHL. There's so much versatility when it comes to Cole Perfetti because he was amazing in the AHL this past year. Again, kind of like, I would say kind of like a Connor McMichael, where he started off a little bit slow, but once he got to that second half in the AHL, he was just off and running. He was doing amazingly. And that is a good sign for a guy that I thought had a little bit of skating issues, a little bit of acceleration issues, maybe a little bit of pace of play issues, but he has cleared that so far. And if he's able to make the NHL and be with the Winnipeg Jets in that top 6, I think he'll fit perfectly. Now we're going to move on to number 5, though, and move on to one of my favorite prospects in the league right now, and definitely one of the more underrated prospects in the league, one of the elite ones in my opinion. We're going to move on to the Florida Panthers' #1 prospect and move on to Anton Lundell. Now, to me, Anton Lundell is a guy that I was super high on in the 2020 draft. I had him 7th overall. A lot of people had him a lot later than that, maybe outside the top 10. He went 12th overall to the Panthers, and basically since that point has been dominant in every single position he's been in. This past year in the Liga was just almost a point per game, but got 16 goals in 25 games played. If that can continue to progress, he could be one of the best prospects from the 2020 draft. Now we're going to move on to number 4, though, and go on to the 4th number 1 prospect in the NHL. This is a guy that I've talked about so much on this channel, so I'm just going to say at number 4, I have Caufield. He's a great prospect. We've talked about him a ton. You know how good he is, and in the playoffs, he also proved that. But now we're going to get into some even more toasty opinions here inside the top 3. Who are the 3 prospects left? I mean, Caufield's gone. You got Perfetti gone. So much talent gone. What will be inside the top 3? We shall see. So you know what? Let's just stop this suspense already, and let's go on to the 3rd number 1 prospect in the NHL. I'm now going to move on to the Anaheim Ducks' best prospect and move on to my boy, Trevor Zegras. Trevor Zegras, Boston University proud, is just one of the most exhilarating, exciting prospects in hockey. He was in the NHL for quite a bit this past season, playing in the NCAA, was just as good as you could possibly get in the World Juniors, and he, of course, this past season broke USA's World Junior goal scoring, or points record, I believe. Just an insanely good player Trevor Zegras is. Now we're going to move on to number 2, though, and I have 2 prospects left, Quinton Byfield and Moritz Seider. But you know what? Honestly, both of these guys are elite franchise prospects in my opinion. But going on to number 2, I'm going to go with the Detroit Red Wings' number 1 prospect and move on to Moritz Seider. Now, Moritz Seider coming in at number 2 is exceptional. I mean, Lucas Raymond will be high up here too, but Moritz Seider even more so. To me, with Detroit, Moritz Seider has been better and just much better than I expected. Obviously, 6th overall back in the 2019 draft. He has developed just supremely well, both in the AHL and the SHL. And I thought I was pretty high on Moritz Seider back in the 2019 draft. I had him 15th overall. A lot of people had him later in the 1st round. Even I was pretty shocked by the 6th overall pick. But man, Stevie Y, you can never doubt him. And so far, Moritz Seider is developing as a number 1 defenseman at the NHL level, and a very good one at that. Now we're going to go on to number 1, the best number 1 prospect in the entire NHL. And I want to stress as well, this guy is still 18 years old, so keep that in mind. But at number 1, as the best prospect, number 1 rise in the NHL, I have to go with the LA Kings' number 1 prospect in Quinton Byfield. Quinton Byfield, to me, even though Moritz Seider is certainly close, Quinton Byfield, to me, is the best prospect in hockey. Still 18 years old. He was really, really good in the AHL in terms of faceoffs, in terms of overall play. I thought that took a big step, and his offense was also really, really solid. To me, he could have a really strong role with the LA Kings this next year, at least as a 3rd-line center, and as another guy that could be in the Calder Trophy conversation. But again, in terms of just pure potential, this is a guy that could be a 1st-line franchise dominant 2-way center at 6'4". There is so much to like, and there's so much time for Quinton Byfield to become that elite centerman. But that is going to be it for today, guys. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the number 1 prospect rankings, make sure you hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, hit that notification bell if you have not already. Comment down below, what do you agree and disagree with, and where do you see your team's number 1 prospects landing in the rankings? Where would you see them in the rankings? Make sure you share this video with your friends. Get it out there, guys. And click on this card right here for all my hockey prospects content. Thank you so much for watching. I gotta go, but I'll see you in the next one. Have a great day, and goodbye.